Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 79 of Yoga Research and Beyond. We're talking about child's pose today, a case study about child's pose. I'm your co-host, Ariana, founder of Yoga Research and Beyond, and a New York City-based yoga teacher, strength trainer, and New York Stretch co-founder.
I'm Jules Mitchell, and I lead continuing education for yoga teachers. My work is mostly in exercise science and biomechanics, but leans really heavy into research literacy, which is why we're here today to talk about some research on child's pose that might be interesting to yoga teachers.
Yeah, it's cool to see a paper on a specific pose like this, even though it's a case study, which we'll get into what that is. The title of this is Yoga in the Emergency Room, Termination of SVT with the Child's Pose. SVT is supraventricular tachycardia, which is basically a very, very elevated abnormal heart rate. Normal varies anywhere from, depending on how old you are, your athletic level, but anywhere from like 40 to 100, and SVT tends to be within like 150 to 250. This study was in the Oxford Medical Case Reports Journal from 2025. Mohammed Zuhair and 4 other researchers wrote the paper, and it was done in London, England. The purpose of it, this is a case study, so it's one person, one patient who has SVT, and she was able to consistently stop the elevated heart rate episodes with child's pose. She's 27 at the time of this paper, and she discovered that child's pose helped with it at the age of 15, I believe. And so they wanted to look at this actually happening in real time in the emergency room. And they're asking the question, can this yoga pose serve as a self-given maneuver to help her manage the symptoms of the SVT? So it's a case study, like I said, so it's one person. And they look at her having this episode in the emergency room. They do an ECG to look at the heart rate and see what the actual levels are when she's having the episode and when she does the child's pose. Her heart rate returned to a normal rhythm within 30 seconds. And the ECG confirmed that before and after. And they talk a little bit about what the mechanisms could have been. It's suggested they're not really trying to prove what the mechanisms were one way or the other. And this person continues to use child's pose to help her with SVT. And she does that instead. At the time of this paper, she uses that instead of any medication or other protocols that require other people to help her reduce her heart rate. And this is the first published case of this kind of thing, of SVT in particular, and child's pose to regulate it. So this is a single case study. This doesn't mean that like this is generalizable. Did I say that right? Mm-hmm. And it's not a randomized control. It's just, anecdotal, which is still valuable, which is a good starting point that could lead to other research. And it doesn't mean that we should start recommending help on our job anyway. But it's still cool to see that this kind of study was done, and particularly, like I said, on a specific yoga pose, which is fun for me to see. It's kind of rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was nice. They showed a video of her doing it. There's a link to it, so I watched it. And I think that might be kind of fun to talk about for a little bit before I get into the more like kind of what case studies are. But they recorded her doing this self-administered, heart rate reduction technique, which is child's pose. And so the way she did it was kind of, because people do child's pose differently, right? So the way she did it was kind of the knees apart so that her chest was a little bit between the legs. So her pelvis was, a little bit more elevated because it was sitting on the heels. So there was this kind of downward slant. And then she had her arms stretched out in front of her. She wasn't making a pillow with her hands or didn't have her hands by her side. She had her arms stretched out in front of her, and she was connected to the machine. And they put actually on the video, they put the data next to it. And so, but you could see she kept actually lifting her head and looking at the machine to see what was happening. And from the recording, she went from 176 to 107 in about 20 seconds, which was pretty cool. That's what was, I know they reported more in the paper, but what they captured. But anyway, I thought that was interesting because I was thinking, oh, well, maybe the head needs to be down. Does the head need to be below the heart? And I mean, it was sometimes, but she kept lifting her head. Anyway, I think that's kind of interesting just because not all child's poses are the same. And if somebody is going to create a randomized control trial around this, that should be taken into account. How is the child's pose being done? And then that goes to, what if somebody can't do full flexion of their knees? What if somebody can't get their hips back? And so then they use a bolster. Now they're propped up. Is that different? Like, there's just a lot to consider. And that's, I think, one of the big limitations on case studies. There's, like you said, you can't generalize out of them, but it's also like one person's experience. As you can tell, this was not an intervention. This is something she's been doing regularly for herself. So it's her experience, which is actually really good. I mean, I like that. It's what we do with as yoga teachers is we kind of help people have an experience that works for them. So it is very in line with yoga teaching, but it was her self-administered pose that gave her a good experience. But you can't replicate it because of her experience. And so in order to replicate it, you'd have to design a randomized controlled trial. And then everybody would have to have the same intervention, the same type of child's pose. You couldn't have one person saying, oh, I can't get my hips back, so I'm going to lay on my back and pull my knees into my chest instead, So that makes it difficult, which is why it's not generalizable.
One little I noticed just about the video compared to their description of the pose. In the description for how they describe the pose, I think they said head resting on something, and hers wasn't. It doesn't really matter, but it's just interesting that, like, in the description of how to do in case they do need, people do want to replicate it. Like, do you go according to the video, or do you have their head resting on something the whole time? So.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be up to, if somebody does want to create an RCT, then that's up to them, obviously, how they would do it. And I'm assuming it would be resting. I think she was just looking because she wanted to see what was happening because she was hooked up to a machine. I'd want to see too. Yeah. But anyway, back to, like, it wasn't an intervention. It sounds like she came to the hospital and she kind of showed them what she does and they decided to turn it into a case study. It wasn't like she was working with a doctor who was like, okay, we're going to try this thing on you and turn it into a case study, because it's kind of the other way around. They were like, oh, let's actually write about this. This is really fascinating. Yeah. Which was cool.
That makes sense. I could see that. It does seem to fit what the situation was. Yeah.
And then the other interesting thing I thought was just back to, like, research methods. In their discussion, they were talking about, like, how yoga, has shown to have benefits in this area. And so they were saying, like, oh, studies of yoga's role in arrhythmia management have suggested that yoga practices can reduce heart rate, blood pressure, psychological stressors, and so on. And then they have some citations. And the citations are more like the effect of yoga, not a single pose, but the effect of, like, a yoga intervention, like going to yoga practices, yoga classes over time. And I just think that's really interesting as well, because this is child's pose. Is it yoga, or is it the position of the body that is you know what I mean? Like, what's the benefit here? And I think it's kind of hard to collapse the two. It's hard to say yoga has been shown to do this because what is it about the yoga? Is it because the shapes that the person is in, or is it because they're going to a weekly class with friends in the community, or is it because they have an hour where they can tune inward and think about other things? Like, And so it's so interesting because the teachers who study with me always want to look at research and know what poses do this. So here we have like a pose, but that's not how like normal yoga interventions work. We don't just say like, hey, we're gonna take 300 subjects with back pain and give half of them downward dog and half of them nothing. And then, like that's really rare. So it's interesting to that they use yoga classes as their discussion, like, oh, it's been shown to, and then here we're just talking about a single pose.
I felt like, because typically that's what you do, you cite other papers, and because there isn't really anything specific about this, I felt they just went general, which is
they had to, of course, but I think as the reader, like that's, I guess, like, yes, you have to. And we've been over this before in many other papers, even doing podcasts back in 2017 about headstand. We've talked about this. Like when there is nothing else, you have to go with what's available because it's a requirement of how research is published. You do this little lit review and you cite what's out there. But what I'm trying to get at for the listeners is just because it says studies of yoga's role doesn't mean that it's necessarily pose specific. You got to go look at those papers and see what those interventions were, because they can make some, you as the reader can make some wild assumptions just based on the way it's worded.
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah. Not blaming the authors for anything. It's just standard normal research technique, but it's on the reader to do the due diligence and kind of look into what's behind the citation. And then I guess I wanted to just kind of say, one of the nice things about case studies are that you get sort of an in-depth qualitative perspective, because it's not really meant to be quantitative because it's n equals 1. So there's really no statistics to run, like there's no trends to see because it's just one person. But you really get into the experience of the individual, again, which I mentioned earlier is great for yoga teachers. And I think it has more like real world context than a randomized controlled trial might be. So like, for example, if you did child's pose on 300 people with SVT, and then you got this like mediocre effect size, and you kind of got some statistics and okay, like this, there's it's statistically significant, meaning, if we grabbed another group of 300 people, we'd get similar results. It's not by chance, but it's there's a mild effect, meaning some people do better than others and some don't respond at all. That kind of tells you about like the intervention itself, like, okay, so does it work or does it not work? So that's that internal validity, which we've talked about so much on this podcast. It tells you how well the intervention for the study works. But what's really more interesting is the external validity, like how does it play out in the real world? And so what's so cool about like case study, especially one like this, is even if we did a randomized control trial and there was these mild effects or whatever, for this individual, it has a real world effect. It actually keeps her from having to take medication. They actually offered an ablation, which is where like they damaged some heart tissue. And she actually turned down the procedure because in the real world, she has such a powerful technique that, again, she got her heart rate down from 176 to 107 in 20 seconds. Like that's amazing. So I think that in a randomized control trial, that kind of effect gets overlooked because that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for trends and patterns. And so here we get to see this like real world effect and the effect that it has on her. And that's not having to do aggressive interventions, healthcare interventions and healthcare procedures because she can auto-regulate. So I think that's cool.
It is really cool to see that it gave her so many choices and she has the ability to choose which one. That was uplifting to me. Just the choices she had. Yeah.
Yep. And then the last thing I just would add is that nice thing about case studies is they are important because they help generate ideas for new research. And that's part of it. So like when we talk about this like hierarchy of research and, randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews are the gold standard, and then down below are things like case studies and editorials. people tend to dismiss those like they're not as important, but they are important to the entire body of research. They do offer contributions and insights, and they are essential for generating ideas for other interventions and new research. So don't be dismissive. And generally, the people that are publishing the case studies and that are publishing the editorials are actually people that are experts in their field and have published many other randomized control trials. So like, it's not like it's just some stranger coming in and doing this case study. It's somebody that's actually been working with patients for a very long time, either researching or as a clinician. Even though we're like, oh, that's lower on the hierarchy, it's still important.
Yeah, very important. And I wonder if we will see more research on this topic. I doubt it for some reason, but I'd like to see more case studies like this.
Mm-hmm.
Be cool.
Yeah.
All right.
That's
I don't
all
have
I got.
anything else. Yeah, same here. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining and listening. Please subscribe and share with other yoga teachers who you think might enjoy it. And let's keep exploring how we can use research to inspire and inform how we teach. Thanks.